So now that you guys have a good idea of rangeland improvements and what those can look like, I want to talk a little bit about rangeland succession. So succession really comes in two major forms, either primary succession or secondary succession. But from a general concept, succession on rangeland is where the orderly change of plants actually occurs over time. So the with succession principles, you'll actually see a gradual replacement of one plant community by another plant community, and that's going to be through a natural process over time. So it's very different than invasive species. So invasive species is an outside force actually changing a plant community. Succession would be part of a natural process. The first type of succession is primary, and primary succession is really where you start with parent material or rock or bedrock. So this for rangelands in the U.S. As well as for most part of the world, primary succession was a thousands and thousands of year process where we created soil from bedrock. However, there are some areas, such as South America, parts of Mexico, Hawaii, that are dealing with primary succession currently, as we're starting to see new rock formations through volcanic activity form, and the weather patterns actually having to start creating sediment from those existing rock formations. The second type of succession is secondary, and this is the one that we deal with most as rangeland managers. And this is where the soil is already in place. You've just had some other sort of event take place that has wiped out a lot of the vegetation. So let's talk first about primary succession. And the bottom line here is that the soils as well as the plants are going to evolve together. So this is a figure out of your book from Dr. Gay in 1965. And he was one of the first ones to coin this primary succession um, term. And he defined it as the plant stage, which we can actually see over here to the left, and the soil development stages really evolve together. So, where we have parent material from a soil standpoint down here during primaries, or the first part of primary succession, as more sediment is broken down and creating more topsoil, we'll see a poorer soil being developed, then a fertile soil, and then a very highly fertile soil. And so, with the plants development, they're going to evolve with the soil. As you can see, the type of plants and organisms that are going to be attached to bedrock is going to be lichens, algae, and mosses, and those are going to help break down the rock material. And then with poor soil, we're going to start seeing early maturing annual forbs and a few annual grasses. And then we'll move into perennial grasses and a few shrubs. And finally, during the highly fertile soil in the climax stage, you'll see a dense stand of tall, deep-rooted plants, and which can also be trees as well. So with primary succession, that's where we really see plants and soil evolving together. So this is going to begin without any soil in place. So again, sides of volcanoes, landslides, places where flooding has taken place and completely wiped out or taken out all of the soil. And the first step is where the living organisms like lichens and mosses and algae are going to attach to the rock and start the breakdown process. And those are going to be involved at this stage because they really don't need soil to survive. So those species that attach to the bedrock we call pioneer species. And from there, the soil is going to then start to form as lichens, and other forces such as weather and wind and erosion are going to help to break down the rocks into smaller pieces and start forming soil. And lichens are really, really important during this stage because as they die, they're going to go through a decomposition phase and they're going to start to add smaller amounts of organic matter to the rock to make soil. So this is an example of primary succession taking place and where we have lots of lichens. around this particular area, and this is all happening on bedrock. So that area in the center, we actually are starting to see some sort of vegetation take place, but there's not really a whole lot of dense soil there. It's a lot of organic matter from the lichens that have died and gone through their life cycle. The second type of succession, again, is what we deal with more often as range managers, and this is secondary. And secondary succession is going to begin in a place where soil has already been established. So secondary succession occurs at a much quicker pace than primary succession, and we see secondary succession events happening after forest fires, after floods, after major weather events, earthquakes, as well as other major natural forces. So the basic idea of succession is that first, the plants that are going to establish as the first life forms in succession, or whether primary or secondary, are very, very simple. So a lot of our annuals. And these are going to go through a life cycle of a year, and they're going to go through their life cycle and die very quickly, and they're going to add to the organic matter. As the soil layer thickens and grass begins to grow, we're going to start seeing more wildflowers as well as other plants that are going to start to grow. So again, more annuals, more herbaceous species. These plants are going to continue to die, ending their life cycle and contribute more nutrients back to the soil. After we get through several years of this process, then you actually have enough topsoil made from organic matter and breaking down of the bedrock that shrubs and trees can then begin to survive. So and at this point we start to see small insects, small birds and mammals begin to inhabit the area. So at this point, what was once now bare rock actually has the potential to support a variety of life. And so we try to manage the forces that cause these type of changes. So just as an example of secondary succession, we're going to start up here with juniper woodlands. So this woodland area is a natural state. So this would be what we call a climax state. And if we have some sort of catastrophic event happen, such as fire, it's going to leave us with a skeleton forest. So we're going to have bare soil, we're going to have lots of dead trees. So the process of returning to that climax state is very process driven. So we're first going to see annual grasses that are going to come back first. The annual grasses are going to be followed by perennial grasses and a forb shrub stage. And then we're going to see perennial grasses and forbs and young junipers come back in this juniper woodland. So those juniper trees are going to be very small. And then eventually, with lots of time, the junipers and the shrubs are going to be taking over the landscape to return eventually to the climax population of the juniper woodland. So some of these forces of ecosystem change that we can actually help manage are, first of all, immigration and establishment of plants. So if we have a fire go through a certain area, we can actually help to get those plants established at a quicker pace by doing some seeding or seeding some actually established plants. A second force is how plants compete with each other. So this is where our invasive species come in. It's very important after a fire has gone through an area, especially here in the West, that we go in and we plant with a favorable plant because if we don't, cheatgrass will move in and even contribute to more fire hazard. We can also modify the site by doing a couple things. Adding organic matter is one type of modification. You can do this a couple of different ways. Animals can actually do it through the grazing process, or you can actually go in and add compost to rangeland. Again, that's management technique I'm mixed on at this point because I'm not sure the economics would ever benefit the cost of actually applying lots of compost to rangeland because the acreage is so extensive. And then a second way to modify the site is to change the available moisture and nutrients. So by being able to, apply some fertilizer or some pesticides or divert water, you may actually be able to increase the fertility of that site. And finally, the fourth ecosystem of change is stabilization. And this is where you would actually work to reduce the variation that comes throughout an entire year. So, both in plants and animals. So you'll see one thing that rangeland managers do after a fire is actually fence off or pull cattle out of that allotment, so that the only animal impact they have is wildlife. So keep in mind the whole goal of succession is to get back to a climax community, and that endpoint, and that's the endpoint of succession. So a climax community is defined as a stable group of plants and animals that are the end result of the succession process. So this could be a forest, trees in a forest, grasses in the prairie in the Midwest, and cactus in the deserts, as well as lichens and shrubs in the tundra. So the climax community very much depends on the climate and where that rangeland region is at. So just some of the things that we can kind of help to mitigate with as rangeland managers really has to do with the forces and the impacts. So the use of fire, the use of grazing, which is herbivory, how climate change plays into this, how humans are actually going to use rangeland. And so what we end up doing is trying to use some of these type of tools for stewardship purposes. And the end result is so that the ecological services and the products that rangeland provides are going to be more abundant. All right, so that's the end of Rangeland Succession. And we will talk about rangeland ecological sites in the next lecture.